husband passed away 10 months ago, or so I believed. I remember the morning they told me. It was a Tuesday in January, the kind of cold that seeps through the walls, no matter how high you turn the heat. My daughter called me from the hospital before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. She said, "Mama, he's gone." And just like that, 41 years of marriage ended with a phone call on a Tuesday morning while my coffee was still warm. His name was Charles. We met at a church social in Baltimore when I was 24 years old. He was wearing a brown suit that was slightly too big for him, and he kept pulling at the sleeve like he was trying to stretch it down to cover his wrist. I thought that was the most endearing thing I'd ever seen. I married him 14 months later. We had a good life. Not a perfect life. Nobody gets that, but a good one. We raised 2 children in the same house in Silver Spring, Maryland, where we'd lived for 33 years. Charles worked at the post office for 28 of those years and retired with a pension that covered most of our bills. I worked part-time at the elementary school down the street as a reading aide until my knees decided they'd had enough. We had dinner at the kitchen table every night. We argued about the thermostat and whose turn it was to call the plumber and whether the back garden needed more mulch. Normal things. Real things. When he had the heart attack, he was alone. That's the part that stayed with me the longest, that I wasn't there. He was at the hardware store on Veers Mill Road, picking up weather stripping for the back door, and he just collapsed in the aisle between the paint section and the lumber. A young man named, I never learned his name actually. Someone called 911, and by the time the paramedics arrived, Charles was already unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at the hospital that afternoon. The death certificate said cardiac arrest. The funeral home took care of everything. My daughter handled most of it because I couldn't. I sat at the kitchen table for 3 days while people brought casseroles and pound cakes and sat next to me on the couch saying things I don't remember. I buried my husband on a Friday. It rained. After that, I did what widows do. I learned how to sleep on one side of the bed. I stopped cooking large meals and started eating soup from a can more often than I cared to admit. I kept his reading glasses on the nightstand for 2 months before I finally moved them to the drawer. I talked to him sometimes in the mornings, the way you do when someone has been part of your routine for so long that the habit of reaching for them doesn't stop just because they're gone. 10 months. That's how long I lived that way. And then I went to the pharmacy. It was the Thursday afternoon in November, ordinary as anything. I needed to pick up my blood pressure prescription and some of that arthritis cream my doctor recommended. The pharmacy is in a strip mall about 2 miles from my house. There's a dry cleaner on one end and a nail salon on the other. And in the middle, the little pharmacy I've used for 15 years. I pulled into the parking lot, found a spot near the entrance, and got out of the car. The automatic doors slid open. I stepped inside. And I stopped. There was a man standing at the greeting card display near the entrance, facing away from me, turning a birthday card over in his hand. He was wearing a dark green jacket, the kind with the quilted lining. He had the same broad shoulders, the same way of holding his neck, slightly tilted to the left, the same hairline, grey at the temples, thinner on top than it used to be. I stood there and I could not move. He turned to put the card back, and for 1/2 second I saw his profile. The jaw, the slight bump on the bridge of his nose from when he broke it playing basketball in 1987. My basket dropped out of my hand and hit the floor. The young woman at the register looked up. "Mom, you okay?" I was not okay. I picked up my basket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I told her I was fine. I was just clumsy. I walked to the back of the pharmacy pretending to look at vitamins, and I watched him. He spent another minute at the card display. Then he walked slowly to the back, to the refrigerated drink section, and opened the glass door and stood there looking at the bottles the way Charles always did. Like choosing between water and iced tea was a decision worth taking seriously. He picked up a lemon-flavoured iced tea, Charles's drink, the exact one. He carried it to the front counter, paid in cash, and walked out. I left my basket on the shelf and I followed him. I know how that sounds. I'm 67 years old. I'm a retired school aide with high blood pressure and bad knees, and I followed a man out of a pharmacy because I thought he might be my dead husband. I know how that sounds, but I want you to understand that my feet made that decision before my mind did. Something in me that was older and more certain than logic walked out those doors after him. He got into a silver pickup truck. I got into my car. I followed him for about 12 minutes. I kept 2 or 3 cars between us. My heart was beating so loudly I could feel it in my throat. Part of me, a small, practical part, was saying, "This is grief. This is what grief does to a person. You see what you want to see." But the other part of me, the part that knew this man's body language, his posture, his particular way of moving through the world, that part was absolutely certain. He turned off the main road onto a residential street I'd never been on. Oak Creek Drive. A quiet street with mature trees and older houses, the kind of neighborhood that was built in the 70s and hasn't changed much since. He pulled into the driveway of a house with grey vinyl siding and yellow shutters. There was a basketball hoop at the end of the driveway and a porch swing that was still moving slightly from the wind. I'd parked at the curb halfway down the block. He got out of the truck. He walked around to the side door of the house. Not the front door, the side door, the way people do when they live somewhere, and the front door is just for company. He used a key. He went inside. I sat in my car for 20 minutes. Then a light came on in the kitchen window and I could see a silhouette moving past it. And then another silhouette, smaller, a child. And then the silhouette of a woman, taller, moving to the sink. A family. There was a family in that house. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for a long time before I could go inside. That night I could not sleep. I lay there looking at the ceiling and I thought about all the things I knew. I knew that man walked like Charles. I knew he held his neck like Charles. I knew he drank Charles's exact drink. I knew he had Charles's hairline and Charles's jaw and the bump from the broken nose. I also knew that I had identified my husband's body at the hospital. I had seen him. I had touched his hand. I had chosen his casket. I had buried him. Those two things could not both be true. And yet, the next morning, I called my daughter. She's 38, lives in Rockville with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. She is the practical one, the organized one, the one who handled the paperwork when Charles died. I told her what I had seen. I told her calmly. I used simple words. I told her where I had followed the man and what house he had gone into. There was a long silence. "Mama," she said, "you've been under so much stress. I know what I saw." I told her. She said she was coming over. She drove over that afternoon and sat at my kitchen table with the same expression her father used to get when he thought I was making something into more than it was. Patient, careful, slightly worried. She said she was concerned about me. She said grief could do strange things. She said she thought I should talk to someone, a therapist, someone at the church, anyone. I showed her the street on Google Maps. I showed her the house. She looked at it for a long time. "Mama, it's probably just a man who resembles Daddy. Then help me find out." I said. She would not. She said it wasn't healthy. She said the best thing for me was to focus on moving forward. She hugged me before she left and told me she loved me and that she'd check in tomorrow. And I watched her pull out of the driveway, and something settled in my chest, something cold and certain. I was going to have to find out on my own. I drove back to Oak Creek Drive the next morning early, before 8 o'clock. I parked at the same spot. The silver truck was still in the driveway. At 8:14, a woman came out at the side door with a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, both of them bundled in winter coats. The woman put the girl in the back seat of a dark blue sedan and drove away. A school drop-off. Just a normal morning. I waited. At 8:47 he came out. This time I saw him full in the face. It was Charles. I want to be very clear about that. I am 67 years old, and I spent 41 years looking at that face across breakfast tables and in the rearview mirror and on the pillow next to mine. I know that face the way I know my own hands. There was no mistake. There was no resemblance. It was my husband, alive, walking to his truck with a travel mug in his hand on a Wednesday morning in November, 10 months after I'd buried him. He backed out of the driveway and left. I sat there for a long time. Then I wrote down the address. When I got home, I started making phone calls. First, I called the funeral home. I was polite. I asked about the death records, the identification procedures. The woman I spoke to was kind and clearly confused by my questions, but answered them as best she could. Then I called the hospital, asked to speak with the records department. I explained that I was the widow of a patient, and I had some questions about the death certificate. They couldn't tell me much over the phone, but they gave me a number to call and a form to request. I also called a man I'd known since we lived in this neighborhood. He'd been a police detective for 20 years before he retired, and I'd known him and his wife since our children were small. I asked if I could come by. He said, of course. I sat in his living room and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. He asked a few questions, careful, specific questions about what I'd seen, when, in what order. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to make some calls?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I do. I want to tell you what he found, but I need to tell you something else first. Because while he was making those calls over the next several days, I was sitting with another question. If Charles was alive, then who had been in that hospital? Who had I identified? Who had I buried? The answer, when it came, was almost too strange to hold. The man in the hospital on that Tuesday in January had a wallet in his pocket. The wallet had Charles's driver's license, Charles's insurance card, Charles's library card. The man who collapsed in the hardware store was carrying Charles's identification, and when the hospital called me and my daughter came and I went in to identify the body, the man had the same general build, was roughly the same age, had some resemblance. I was in shock. I was looking at someone I expected to see. I said yes, and then I signed the paperwork. What I did not know, what no one told me at the time, was that this man was not Charles. He was a man from Manassas, Virginia. He had Charles's wallet because Charles had given it to him. They had known each other for years, apparently, in a way I had no knowledge of. My retired detective neighbor found this out through a combination of calls to people he knew in the county and some research I won't describe in detail because I still don't fully understand it. What I understood was my husband had known this man was going to use his identity. He had planned it. Charles had arranged to disappear, and another man's death, a man who apparently had no family looking for him, no one who would ask questions, had given him the opportunity. I thought about all the small things I hadn't noticed. The life insurance policy Charles had taken out 18 months before he died, naming me as beneficiary. I had thought it was just responsible planning. The way he had cleaned out the storage unit and said he was donating things. The weekend trip to see an old friend in Richmond that he took 6 weeks before the heart attack, a trip he never took before in our married life, a trip that I had been glad about because I thought he was finally taking time for himself. I thought about all of it, and I felt something I can only describe as the floor dropping out from under me. Not grief. Something worse than grief. Because grief I knew how to carry. Grief I had already been carrying. This was something else. This was the discovery that the life I thought I knew had a door in it I never found. And then I thought about my daughter. I called her. I told her what I had found. This time, the silence on the other end was different. "Mama," she said finally, "I have to tell you something." She had known. Not everything. She insisted on that, and I believe her because she's not capable of full deception. I know her. But she had known something. When she was helping with the paperwork after the funeral, she had found a note in Charles's desk. A handwritten letter addressed to her, not to me. It told her that he was sorry. It said there were things she would come to understand. It told her not to tell me. It said he had made arrangements and that we would be taken care of, and that sometimes a man reaches a point in his life where the only way forward is to start again, and he was sorry, and he loved us. She had kept that letter for 10 months. She had sat across from me at Christmas dinner. She had caught me every Sunday. She had held my hands at the gravesite. And she had kept that letter in a shoebox in the back of her closet. I am telling you this part the hardest way because it was the hardest part, the part with my daughter. I had survived what Charles did. I did survive it, I want you to know that. But sitting in my kitchen hearing my daughter tell me what she had known and kept hidden all those months, that was when I finally cried. I had not cried through the funeral or the hospital or any of it. I cried then. I did not yell at her. I did not say all the things that were rushing up through me. I listened to her tell me she was afraid, that she thought I couldn't handle it, that she told herself she was protecting me. I listened to her say she was sorry more times than I could count. And when she was done, I said, very quietly, I need you to give me some time. I hung up. Then I called my retired detective neighbor back. I told him everything my daughter had said. He listened, and then he told me what my options were. He walked me through them calmly, practically. What could be reported? What constituted fraud? What the life insurance implications were, because there were serious implications. I had received a payout on a policy, a payout that was based on a death that had been staged. I called a lawyer. She specialized in elder law and estate matters, and someone from my church recommended her. I sat in her office and laid out everything I knew, in order. She asked me questions. She wrote things down. When I finished, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You have a case. Several, actually. I will not walk you through all of the legal details because they are still ongoing and because, frankly, some of them are not mine to discuss publicly. What I will tell you is that I went to the house on Oak Creek Drive not to confront, not to cry or yell or beg for an explanation. I went because I needed to close something that had been left open. I rang the front doorbell. The woman who answered the door was younger than me, mid-40s, I'd say. She had a kind face, actually. I felt strange noticing that. She looked at me with the expression of someone who is about to say they're not interested in whatever is being sold. And then she looked at me more carefully, and something in her face shifted. I think she recognized something in the way I was standing. "Is your husband home?" I asked. She said he wasn't. "My name is Meredith," I said. "I'm his wife, his legal wife. We've been married for 41 years. There is no graceful way to tell someone that. There is no kind word order." I watched her face go through about 4 different expressions in as many seconds. Then she stepped back from the door and quietly closed it. I went home. My lawyer was already in contact with the relevant authorities. I did not need to do anything else on Oak Creek Drive. Several weeks later, Charles was located. I don't know all the details of how that happened, and I am at peace with not knowing. What I know is that there were legal consequences for the identity situation, for the insurance fraud, for all of it. Those wheels turn slowly, but they do turn. My daughter and I are still working through things. That is the truest way I can put it. We talk on Sundays still, but the calls are shorter now, and there are pauses in them where before there were none. I don't know how long it will take. I know I love her. I know she loves me. I know that people make choices when they're afraid that they would not make otherwise, and I know that doesn't make the choices right. We're working through it. I moved the reading glasses from the nightstand drawer and put them in a box in the garage. That felt important, a small thing, but the small things are what a life is made of. I started going back to my book club, which I had stopped attending after the funeral. I took a watercolor class at the community center, something I had wanted to do for years and never made time for. I made time for it now. I'm not particularly talented, but I enjoy it enormously, and at this point in my life I have learned that enjoyment does not require talent. I still live in the house on the same street in Silver Spring. My grandchildren come on Saturdays. I make them pancakes, and they watch cartoons and they argue about which shows to watch. And I sit in the kitchen and listen to them argue and feel, despite everything, profoundly grateful. I tell you this story not because I want sympathy. I have had enough casseroles to last me the rest of my life, but because I think there are women who will hear it and recognize something. The way you can trust completely and still not know everything. The way grief can make you feel like you're losing your mind when in fact your mind is the only thing working correctly. The way the people around you, even the ones who love you, sometimes fail you in the moments that matter most. Trust what you know. Trust your own eyes, your own memory, your own recognition of the person you have spent your life beside. No one can tell you what you saw. I know what I saw, and I know what I did about it.